Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop, all the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Good evening. Welcome to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Lindsey Davis Stover, and I'm excited to have with me this evening Kofi Annon, who's the founder of the Activated People. Kofi, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Lindsey. It's a pleasure.
Well, tell us about the Activated People. Tell us about this organization and what led you to be a founder of it.
Sure. So the organization, the Activated People, is actually in the middle of a transition. So we started late in the fall last year as a magazine that was dedicated to social justice topics. And over early this year, we wanted to transition to use it also as a platform to do work in the community, social justice work. So we transitioned over to being a nonprofit organization, or currently in the process of doing so. But through that platform, I also led an effort to, everything was kind of happening around the same time, but around the time when the COVID-19 crisis was starting to really develop, we saw an opportunity there to start using the Activated People as a platform to do work in the community. And then when George Floyd incident happened, we also saw that as a reason for us to really dig our heels in and try to figure out what we can do to try to promote change and use this as an opportunity for us to organize around those efforts.
Well, you've been so active in our community and you've done so many incredible things. And I know a lot of our conversations have been around social justice. And we see that the need for it now more than ever. And, you know,
Absolutely.
I think too, we're really seeing the outpour of people who understand that we can't wait any longer for these changes. Can you talk a little bit about the organization and how it's really harnessing in a way that the power of the people right now, as folks are willing to march in the streets and stand up for these social justice changes and reforms?
Yeah, absolutely. This is really unprecedented, an incredible time for our nation. This is something that none of us will ever forget. To be able to just witness it and participate in it in this is really unbelievable. And so we thought that this was really a moment that we really need to start to get involved. We really need to do whatever it is we could to galvanize and to mobilize and to organize in order to not just to take some of that energy that we were seeing in the streets and to use that to try to galvanize around and organize around the people. Because a lot of times what happens is that these moments, there's a lot of marching in the street. We've all seen this before. There's protests, there's riots, there's a lot of energy in the streets, but then people get frustrated a couple of weeks later because it doesn't translate into the type of social justice legislative changes that we all really want to see. And so this really is an unprecedented moment. Like you said, we've now witnessed the longest running and largest, most widespread protest our nation has ever witnessed. And so we think that in order to make sure that we feel like we should see legislative changes that match that energy, right? So not just something that kind of tinkers around the edges. We want to see some transformational changes around police reform, and we want to make sure that the narrative and those that fire isn't lost. We want to make sure that we actually see some real bread and butter changes to go along with that. So that's the reason we launched the Virginia Coalition for Transforming Police. We wanted to make sure that we coordinated a lot of people around the state. We held a series of town halls. We had about 5 town halls involving hundreds of people, literally over 500 people participated in some of these online discussions and surveys. We had a Northern Virginia one, a Southern Virginia one, a East, and so we had a lot of conversations with a lot of people. A lot of organizations took part in these conversations, and we came up with what we call the reimagined police package. And so this was something that was led by the activated people, but it's now encompassing over 50 different organizations, traditional activist organizations, as well as other like religious institutions and so forth, who all want to see the change happen.
Absolutely. Well, I've known you for several years now, and you do such an incredible job of bringing our community together around important causes. And it does not surprise me that so many organizations have stepped forward. And it was incredible to see the town halls that you led across the state, because I would assume many of these town halls were in areas that maybe haven't had these hard discussions in a really long time. Can you talk about some of the things that you learned from around the Commonwealth as you were having these town halls and these discussions?
Yeah, well, so there were a lot of ideas. We ultimately settled on about over 40 different legislative recommendations, but there were some key fundamental values that people really wanted to see. And so some of those key fundamental values was defunding the police. People wanted to see the police involved in less, right? I think there's a greater recognition now that police get called to do far too much, and they're asked to do things that they aren't really very good at. They're really good at arresting people, and when it comes time to use force, they do that stuff. However, studies by the Brookings Institute have shown that up to like 9 out of 10 calls really aren't anything violent that police have to deal with on average, nationwide, right? So we're talking about 90% of the things. Really, we need to ask ourselves, do we really need to have police involved in this? And these are that's one of the things that came out of these discussions. People wanted to see less policing, especially when it came to issues that didn't necessarily require the use of force or violence or people having mental issues or homelessness issues or things like that. And then also people wanted to see things like better training, right? Better, more qualified immunity, so that police can be held accountable. People wanted to see more civilian oversight, not just from the standpoint of on the accountability side in the end when things go wrong, but people wanted to see more civilian oversight throughout the process, even from the very beginning in the recruiting phase to evaluation phase. People wanted to see more civilians involved in controlling how the police operated. So those were some of the key things that came out of those discussions.
And what important takeaways to be able to pull together. And I know you've done a lot of work on creating some legislative solutions and priorities. One of the things that your organization has really called upon is defunding the police. And I know many politicians right now, are hesitant to use that phrase. Can you talk a little bit about what it actually means? And the courage that we need to demand from our elected leaders right now?
Absolutely. So unfortunately, the term defunding the police carries a little bit of stigma behind it at this point, because it's become very politicized. You see even the president using it as a fundraising tool, and trying to galvanize his base around the term. And so we see, on the other side, you see Democrats starting to shy away from the term. But this term has been around forever, right? And the reason we want to stick to this term is because we do believe that, first of all, it's a very pragmatic thing to think about. Most police budgets have gone up, even though crime overall has gone down. And we've seen this not just right now, we've seen this since the 90s. Even through periods when crime was stable or even decreased, we still see police budgets increasing. And so just from a sheer budgetary standpoint, we think that this is a very practical thing to ask for, a very pragmatic thing to ask for. But also symbolically, I think a lot of people don't really understand the history of policing and how police disproportionately have always targeted Black and brown communities and always looked at Black and brown communities differently. And if you trace the roots of policing, they actually start off with slavery. So policing units were first were first implemented to catch runaway slaves. After slavery ended, those the police were then used to the one loophole in the 13th Amendment allowed for people who were caught committing crimes to be put back into slavery. So then the policing units, they weren't called police at the time, but those same units were then used to capture people to put them back into slavery. And then the first formal police force was actually founded in Boston in 1883, and that was a reaction to blacks moving up to northern states. And so they were then used to contain and oppress black populations in the North. So black people have always been treated differently by policing, and so there was always going to be that sense of distrust. And so when you see the black people calling for less of this policing, it comes from a knowledge and history that our communities aren't treated the same, and probably will never get the same fair shake at how as white communities does. And so that's why we wanted to remain true to what the movement is calling for.
That's so important. And talk a little bit, you did talk about, how this term is being politicized. And, you even see Democrats that are shying away from using it. Can you talk about the courage that we need from our elected leaders in this moment right now?
Yeah, so we need them to, especially in an age where you have Donald Trump's, ran on a platform of banning Muslims and building a wall and separating kids and all types of crazy, outlandish things. We think that what we're asking for is very reasonable, right? And we need our elected officials, especially now with a Democratic majority in office, to step up to the plate for this, not shy away from this. We understand that there is some controversy, but we need them to actually go to fight for us. This is what the community is asking for. This is what we've elected them to do, to represent us, and we want them to respond to the moment with a similar passion and a similar fight, and not shy away, not duck from these issues, not duck from controversy. We understand that this is going to be tough, but whether they call it defunding or whether they call it something else, we want to see money that is currently allocated to the police shifted to programs that uplift black and brown communities, that are shown to be more effective at preventing crime from the first place. So things like affordable housing, things like education, paying counselors to, instead of school resource officers to intervene and to come to find some solutions. Homelessness prevention programs. These are the underlying problems that lead to high rates of crime. And so if we understand that, and we've always understood that, then we need to we want our elected officials to shift their way of thinking to not just doing the same things that they normally do and listening to the same groups of people that they always listen to, but listen to some of these underserved communities who are saying that this model of policing isn't working, and to do so in a bold way.
Well, and the programs that you're talking about have been traditionally underfunded in so many ways. And I know we've spoken about before the lack of affordable housing and making that a priority here in Fairfax County. And you see that in communities all over the country right now. And so I think the basic understanding of these increased police dollars going to programs that will uplift communities is a real conversation that people are starting to have. And you can see the support behind it, because without question, education, workforce development, affordable housing, the programs you just described have traditionally been underfunded. And I know you've actually been on Inside Scoop before talking about the need for Fairfax County to make affordable housing a priority, not just with words, but as a budget priority as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So on average, and so, yeah, I know I've focused most of my energy on Fairfax County over the years, but nationally, on average, most large jurisdictions spend about 8% of their budget on policing versus 5% on affordable housing. Imagine if that was reversed. We feel like these types of reversing the way of doing things will actually produce a much better result in the long term. teachers, getting universal pre-K. A lot of these adults and teenagers that grow up to have these run-ins with law enforcement, if you trace their lives going back to when they were kids, they've struggled and haven't been able to have the amount of resources and things that they need to be able to escape some of their circumstances in the first place. So those are the types of things that we would really like to see our elected officials focus more on, not just locking people up when they were faced with all these hurdles in the first place.
Absolutely. And I know people sometimes counter this argument by saying, well, we just need to increase the funding dollars for our police officers. And while we may need to increase training and those training funds, can you talk a little bit about that? Because you do hear a lot, well, we don't need to defund the police. In fact, we just need to increase their training. And can you talk about the fault in that argument too? Because I think people sometimes don't see the full picture when this particular issue comes about.
Yeah, so that is something that we constantly have to fight against. So, and this may seem like we're being inconsistent, but we're not. So we do believe that training is necessary, right? That is one of the foundational elements of our package. We do want to increase training. Virginia, nationally, the requirements for training are less than a lot of the other states. Some states require twice as many hours of training as Virginia does. However, we feel like that should be done with the existing budgets. We don't feel like you should add additional money to those budgets. And the reason we don't prioritize training as much as we do the accountability and recruiting and all the other things is that time and time again, this is always used as something that is a solution to crime, but to bad policing and police brutality. When we see, this is with George Floyd, for example, there's no amount of training that would tell you that you can't kneel on a person's neck for almost 9 minutes, right? Like that was just you can't train somebody not to be racist or not to treat people humanely. And so maybe there was something on the recruiting side that maybe this person should not have been an officer to begin with. Maybe there's more accountability measures that needed to be in place so that he didn't feel like he could get away with this, because he clearly felt that he could get away with this. And so, we just don't want to keep doing the same things over and over and over and expecting a different result. Training is always kind of put up there as something that needs to happen, but we know that in and of itself is not going to be the answer. We do need stronger accountability. We do need more civilian oversight. And we do need to take away some of these responsibilities to have less interactions with the police so that the police aren't called out for every single thing.
Absolutely. And let's talk a little bit about that, because I know the plan calls for a reduction in interactions between police and the community. And we've touched on it a little bit, but can you break that idea down for us and that initiative down?
Right. So a lot of times when, one of the things that people would suggest is that we need to have more interactions with the police. The police need to get to know the community better. And that way that would prevent them from brutalizing people when push comes to shove. And that just never proves to be true. There's just no study that shows that more policing leads to better treatment of community members, specifically Black and Brown community members. So we feel like we need to go the opposite direction. We need to reduce the amount of interactions, because when you have less policing, then less interaction, then you have less cause for something to go wrong. You have people not getting profiled as much and things like that. And so that's the general sentiment behind that statement. We just want to have less interactions so that we have less cause for things to go wrong, less opportunities for things to go wrong.
Absolutely. And I know you talk a lot about increasing accountability. And I think across the board, right, it's very clear that accountability needs to be increased. Can you talk a little bit about what that actually looks like in terms of What steps can our legislators take to ensure the right accountability measures are put in place?
So again, we feel like the civilian oversight needs to be as a critical component to accountability, because we don't, one of the things we kept hearing from the public is that they do not trust the police to hold themselves accountable. They do not trust the police to investigate themselves. Every year here in Fairfax County, there are hundreds of use of force cases, but somehow none of them ever get investigated or called or found to be, the officer was doing something wrong. And we just think that's just unrealistic. And so we feel like the one of the key pillars that needs to be implemented is more outside intervention, more civilian oversight, and maybe even taking some of the Commonwealth attorneys out of the equation from the accountability standpoint, because the Commonwealth attorney is the one that has to bring charges in any case, right? The Commonwealth attorney's office, and so they bring charges against the police department. Now, what's problematic in that is that the Commonwealth attorney works with the police on a daily basis and relies on the police to help close their cases. They prosecute these cases. Mm-hmm. So it's very basically, even though they're separate, they are colleagues in a sense. And so we just don't think it's very realistic to expect Commonwealth attorneys to really hold police accountable on, regularly or systemically. We feel like there should be another more civilian intervention into that process to make sure that this is fair and there isn't a conflict of interest there.
And I think that's really key, the civilian piece, right? And more involvement, because that's ultimately going to improve transparency, which I know is another pillar that you've really talked about the importance of, and right. Ensuring that, our community understands what's going on and we can react or act accordingly. Can you talk a little bit about right now, the lack of transparency that we have in the process?
Right. So every jurisdiction is different. So one of the things we're trying to ask our legislative officials to do is to mandate greater transparency across the board. So use of force cases, we want those collected, the demographics of the officer of the police force. Basically, every time there's an interaction, whether it be traffic stops, you name it, we want that information to be collected, and we want it to be publicized, and we also want the demographics and the racial breakdown of the people involved in those incidents to be publicized as well, collected and publicized. Right now, there isn't a guarantee that these things are even being collected across the state because there's no uniform standards to do so. And there's definitely no uniform standards as far as like when it gets publicized. And as far as civilian review is concerned, we want to make sure that we have more civilian reviews panels, and that we also give them the authority to have subpoena power so that they can actually investigate issues independently, and also recommend and implement punishments independently of what the police do themselves.
And I know we just have a few minutes left in this segment, so I really want to dive into this in our next segment. But, here in Fairfax County, we already have... I
lost audio for a second there. Sorry.
It's good. So here in Fairfax County, we already have a civilian review panel.
Sorry.
Can you talk a little bit about the current limitations on that panel? Because I think, when we talk about increased civilian review, I've heard many people say, well, actually, we already have that. And talk a little bit about what their limitations are right now, because they don't actually have the full scope of oversight that you just described.
Okay, I had some audio issues for part of your question there, but I think your question was that to explain a little bit more about the civilian review and why that's important. Civilian oversight panels, yes. Correct?
Yes, okay. Absolutely. And I know we're all adjusting to this new world of online, even television broadcasting right now. So no, that's fantastic. But I was just talking about, and we just have about 2 minutes in this segment, so we can talk more about it in the next segment. But I've heard many people say, well, we actually already have a civilian review panel in Fairfax County, right? And while technically we may have one, can you talk a little bit about the limitations that they have that don't necessarily allow them to have the full transparency and accountability that's really needed?
Sure. So we've had a civilian review panel in Fairfax County for about 3 or 4 years now. However, the reason that doesn't have as much teeth as needed in order to be effective is because they don't have subpoena power. Meaning they essentially all they can do is take whatever the police gives them after the police is done investigating and kind of look it over and say whether or not they thought the investigation did a good job or not. That's not what people really expect or hope for with a civilian review panel. I think most people would like to know that there is an ability to conduct their own independent investigations, and there's some legislation that should be going through the General Assembly special session that would give local jurisdictions the ability to do that. And that's the key. That's really the key component. The other key component is to making sure that after they look at this and they see that, okay, this officer, did something wrong, and then they can actually do something about it. Right now, they don't actually have the ability to recommend or implement any type of punitive action.
Well, that's an important note. And I know in our next segment, we're going to really talk about what legislation could be up here in special session next week and talk about ways in which our viewers can also get involved with the efforts. So please stay with us. We'll be right back.
Maria, so how's work?
It was 4th period biology. Our students just weren't getting how easily viruses spread. So Miss Bell and I had them role play a zombie virus outbreak. By the time they had all learned the lesson, all the living were dead. Hey, how's your job going?
That big sales meeting I planned? Next year, I might get to go.
Cool.
Okay, so we drowned the fire.
Yep.
Stirred it. Drowned it again. And now just feel if it's cold.
Yeah.
Cool.
Smokey just gave me a bear hug.
I know. I already posted it.
When I was your age, I was just like you, fascinated by stars. But now I get to search for life in the universe. And who knows, maybe life is looking for us too.
So we're like aliens to them?
Yeah. Does anyone want to be a scientist now?
I do.
Awesome. We need more girls in STEM.
Maybe we can find aliens.
You may have heard people talking about the April 1st United States Census and wonder what it's all about. The census is a count of everyone currently living in the country. It happens once every decade, and it's at the heart of how Fairfax County serves our residents. The census helps determine how much funding Fairfax County receives from the $675 billion that the federal government allocates each year to improve transportation, provide education, healthcare, affordable housing, and prepare for emergencies. For each resident who does not respond to the census, Fairfax County could lose $12,000 in potential funding over the next 10 years. Imagine if one family of 4 doesn't reply, or 10 families of 4. The amount of lost resources for our community could really add up. The census helps Fairfax County decide where resources go based on where people live, including schools, roads, firehouses, police stations, and clinics. It establishes how many representatives we send to Richmond and Washington, D.C. to advocate for our community. You can have a big impact by completing the 2020 census. The U.S. Census Bureau will mail every household an invitation in March to complete a simple questionnaire about who lives at your address on April 1st. You can respond online, by phone, or by mail. The form will ask for names, age, sex, race, and the relation of everyone living in your household. To ensure a complete and accurate count, census takers visit residents who do not respond. Federal law keeps those responses safe, secure, and confidential. Your name and address cannot be shared with law enforcement, immigration enforcement, or any other government agency under any circumstance. The information is only used to create accurate statistics about the nation's people, places, and economy to help serve our community. In Fairfax County, we believe everyone counts, no matter how young, how old, or your immigration status. If you live here, we want you to be counted. Visit fairfaxcounty.gov/topics/census to learn more. And remember, in Fairfax County, everyone counts.
It's all of our responsibility to slow the spread of the coronavirus. So follow guidance from authorities where you live and stay home unless absolutely necessary. You can still use your outdoor spaces like yards and decks. It's also okay to go for a walk or exercise outside. Wear a cloth face covering, stay at least 6 feet away from other people, try not to touch any surfaces, and wash your hands for at least 20 seconds as often as possible. Visit coronavirus.gov for the latest information.
All right, pal. Get ready for the day, buddy.
Hey, Dad. Hey, Dad. Do we have a gun?
What's that?
Do we have a gun?
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Lindsey Davis Stover, and we're continuing our conversation with Kofi Annon, the founder of the Activated People. Kofi, thank you again for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you again.
And I know when we finished our last segment, we were discussing the limitations that are currently put on the civilian review panel and working to ensure that overall there's more accountability and transparency within the system. One of the issues I'd love to get your thoughts on are calling for the end of a school resource officer. Can you talk a little bit about that program and why it's so important that we ensure that that position no longer exists moving forward?
Yeah, thank you again. So I would like to say that my thought process on the school resource officer has evolved over time, over the last few years. So just to kind of give everyone a little bit of background, in 2018, when I was working through the NAACP, we led an effort to put some limitations around what the school resource officer did. After doing some investigating, we found out that a lot of what the school resource officer got involved in was a lot of disciplinary issues. But when an officer gets involved in disciplinary issues, it becomes a criminal issue. And so things like disorderly conduct, things like a kid acting up, which is what, how things are, how you would normally characterize misbehavior in school. Well, those things became criminal offenses like disorderly conduct. Things like kids fighting in school, as bad as it is, those became assaults, right? Even theft became larceny and grand larceny and things like that. A kid coming to school when they weren't supposed to, well, that became trespassing. There are a lot of things that just started criminalizing kids unnecessarily. And then what we also found was that about 65% of those kids that were arrested were Black and brown kids. And so you had a disproportionate impact on the African American and Latinx communities, and you also had them getting funneled into the criminal justice system, what was commonly referred to as the school to prison pipeline unnecessarily. Even though they had other mechanisms in place like restorative justice and things like that, those weren't being applied to African American and Latino kids at the same rates. So those were some of the underlying problems. So that led us to do some more investigating to try to figure out, well, was there some policy changes that we could get to prevent some of this from happening? And so we started looking at what is called a memorandum of understanding. That is an understanding between the police system, the police departments, and the school system. And so after looking through that MOU, we found there were just a lot of loopholes and things that were very inconsistent with what the model MOU from the state would recommended. things like calling officers administrators, which undermine kids' constitutional rights, or not giving parents any explicit rights to intervene or to even know that their kid was being questioned, or even making sure that the kids understood their rights or were read their rights before they were questioned or searched, and things like that. And there was no distinct line between what was an administrative issue versus what was a criminal issue. So the new MOU that we got, and also training, we're going back to the training word. So we also mandated that all officers, all school resource officers received implicit bias training and disability awareness training and crisis intervention training. All these things to prevent kids from being introduced into the criminal justice system unnecessarily. And initially had a really huge impact right off the bat. The very first semester that kids went back to school after the new laws were put into place, we saw a 60% drop in the number of arrests. It was immediate. It was clearly had a great impact, and we all celebrated. But looking back now, so a couple of months ago, we did some more investigation, and we found to kind of see where the numbers stood, and we found out we were celebrating maybe a little bit too prematurely, because things had basically reverted back to where they were before, even though the new MOU prevented, at least on paper, prevented these things from happening. Right. So kids were still getting arrested for all the things that they were getting arrested for in the first place. And no one was holding the officers accountable. The administration didn't seem to, maybe they didn't quite understand, maybe the training wasn't happening to let everyone know like how they should be acting under these new MOUs. Whatever the case may be, there was clearly a disconnect, and the kids were suffering because of it. So I say all that to say, when people when you hear activists say that, we just need to defund, we just need to separate, we just need to create less interactions between the police and the community, this is one of those examples where we say, well, clearly policy changes alone aren't going to solve the problem. We just need to create less touch points between the police and the community. And certainly, I think most people would agree that creating less touch points between police and kids are necessary. And this is one of those opportunities that we think we have to do just that. Taking the police out of schools doesn't necessarily make the schools any less safe, doesn't make students any less safe, even if they're parked outside of the school, and preventing anything from, however may be. We feel like this is one of those things that it touches a lot of areas that we care about. Less interactions, less money being funded to the police. And if we then replace those school resource officers with counselors, well, that's the spirit of what defunding is, right? So you take money from the police and you put it into something that actually helps to prevent something bad from happening in the first place, in a way that uplifts the kids and creates actual solutions by trained professionals who were trained to deal with these types of issues versus a cop. So that's how my personal evolution of how we should approach this issue stands, and that's one of the reasons why I've embraced the call to take police out of the schools now, whereas I hadn't before.
Sure. No, and I think that's really important too. Making the point that policy doesn't always make the needed changes. While policy is so important, it's important that we also, ensure that the outcomes are matching the intent, rather. And you had really touched on a good point. We hear time and time again that our schools don't have the funding to have the appropriate counseling resources that need to be available to students. And whether it's, career counseling or additional education counseling, or just helping with, mental health needs that we know right now, the pressures on our students are so great. And so that, to me, is such an important push to ensure that we give students the resources they need to, embrace their future, but also to deal with so many important mental health care needs that we know students can have.
Right. And just police just aren't the best equipped to do those things.
Right.
All those things you just mentioned, they may get a couple of weeks training here on crisis intervention training, or they may get a couple of, weeks there. But you put that officer against a counselor who's spent their entire career dedicated to counseling and improving kids' way of thinking. There's just no match, and so that's really who should be involved in some of these kids. And we're talking as young as middle school here, so we're talking 11, 12, 13-year-old kids who are getting charges for criminal charges, and it's essentially putting them on a path to the criminal justice system and stigmatizing them, at a very young age. And so it's not good for anyone, to do this. So
it's amazing to hear. I mean, when you say middle school, realizing that is 11-year-old kids. I mean, they are still in so many ways, kids in the truest sense, right? And to have that, to carry with them in many cases for the rest of their life is so tough, and something that we all should be working to get changed in our communities.
Absolutely.
Now, I know we are about to embark on a special legislative session here in Virginia next week. In fact, I believe they go in on the 18th. What would you like to see as some of the top priorities that our legislators really push in this special session next week?
Hopefully we can get everything, right?
Yeah.
So yes, of course we're expecting some of these things will get pushed to the regular session, 2020 session, because some of the stuff we were asking for are really big muscle movement issues that probably require a lot of debate. But we are moving in the right direction. So we know that sometime last week there was a decision made to extend the session so we could actually have some full debate, right? So that was huge. That was key, and I think that was a direct response to a lot of our advocacy, because we are asking for a lot, right? And we are asking for a lot, and we're unapologetic about it, because we feel like there's also there's nothing like the present when it comes to getting legislation done, right? The type of attention that police reform is getting now will not be the same come January, because come January, then it's mixed in with thousands of other priorities and bills and everything that our legislation has to go through. At least during the special session, they have a lot fewer issues that they can focus on. It's COVID, police reform, and the budget, and how those three things interact. Right. So there's just no time like the present right now to make sure that we get as much as possible. So that's what we're shooting for. So I'm only kind of half kidding when I say we want it all. Right. But the reality is that we do. These are things that are long overdue. And that's what this is what the community needs. This is what the community wants. You have the longest running protest in our nation's history. And our elected officials need to respond accordingly. They need to match that intensity and dedication when they go to the General Assembly session in August. And that's what we're hoping for. As far as the priorities, so again, the defunding issue is a key priority. We do want them to take responsibilities away from the police and put them into alternative programs, organizations, whatnot, to make sure that police aren't responding to everything anymore, right? That should be that's a principle decision that our legislators officials can make, and that is one of those fundamental things that kind of sets the scene for everything else, right? Once we get less police doing less, then we also take some money and we could put that money into things that uplift the community, and that sets the foundation for everything else we do. So the other priorities is just creating these more civilian oversight, right? Authorizing all the jurisdictions across the Commonwealth to have stronger civilian review, and making sure that civilian review has the subpoena power in place, to to create the type of oversight that the community needs, and that the community will feel comfortable with. I think once we, and then the accountability piece, to making sure that there is more accountability. There is no more qualified immunity. Police don't feel comfortable that they can do whatever and just kind of get away with it, because they're just, that's just how it's always been. And I think once we have those three things in place, those three priorities in place, then I think the other parts of the puzzle will kind of come together.
Absolutely. Are there current pieces of legislation that are being talked about that our viewers could either follow or advocate for when they do go into special session next week?
So it's been slow,
Sure.
but there are some pieces of legislation that are starting to drop. We know there are about 15 when I last checked that were actually put into the system that we can kind of go in and look at right now. Excuse me. Some of the key ones that we're currently working on have not been made public at this point. So things like the qualified immunity bill, we do believe that will be put in there. The civilian review panel bill, the school resource officer bill, and there is probably going to be likely going to be an effort to create some of these alternative mechanisms to deal with policing as well. I believe that there's also going to be a push to end automatic license plate readers. That's one of those things that people don't really quite understand just how those works, but they assume that it's fair because it's just reading everyone. But depending on how those things are set up, where they're set up, which communities they're set up in, that could and often is done in a way that disproportionately targets Black and brown communities as well. And so those are some of the things that we expect to get passed this year.
That's great. Now, Kofi, you mentioned qualified immunity, and that's something that we haven't talked about. Can you explain what that is and why it's so important?
Yeah, so it's about right now, the reason that there isn't as much accountability and the police understand that there isn't accountability is because qualified immunity essentially lets the police know that, hey, if you commit a crime during the course of your job, then there's a good chance that under this statute, then you will not be held accountable for it because you will get the benefit of the doubt, right? And so that's kind of distilling it into really easy to understand terms. But the point of it is that we have to take that off the table. Police should be held accountable to follow the same laws that, and even so, even a higher standard, I believe, than the average civilian. So no one else gets to commit crimes and receive immunity from it. And so our police officers shouldn't be as well, because they're the ones that we look to uphold the crime, to uphold the law, and they're the ones that enforce these laws and hold people accountable. So they need to be held to those same very high standards as well.
Absolutely. It's everything that you've talked about. I hope we do get it all, because it's so important. And it's so important that our legislators create policy that meets the moment that we're in right now. And we talked a little bit about, in the beginning of the show, about the importance of this moment, but also how incredible the activism has been in this moment, and continuing to keep that momentum. And you did briefly talk about, what does this momentum look like in January or February, right? We don't know exactly what that is. And can you talk a little bit about ways in which people can stay activated and stay motivated? Because these changes, while we hope they're swift, may not be. And we can't stop, right, continuing to push these issues. Can you talk a little bit about what that activism looks like and why it's so important to keep that momentum strong?
Yes, absolutely. So a lot of times throughout, whenever there's mass movements or protests or things like that, about 95% of the people drop off, or lose interest, because just once the media loses interest, unfortunately, the rest of the public generally loses interest. And so I'll be perfectly honest, I was surprised at just how long these protests last and were sustained. And I'm proud of the American people, that the way that they stood up, and really around the world, because these protests went global. There were people protesting in Australia about Black Lives Matter. So this really an incredible moment. And that was very important for us to even having this discussion right now about the potential for having some of these changes. But now it's time to move, that we're moving into the next phase of this, to make sure that we've marched, and now we've organized, and now we want legislation done. In order to get that legislation, we need people to contact their elected officials directly. Don't just assume that an organization is going to do it, because as you know, even though we organize, we're only as strong as the people that have our back, basically, right? So we need the people to also follow up with their elected officials to say, hey, look, we do support this reimagined police package, and we want to see you pass put forth bills and pass these things to get them done. Numbers matter. All those phone calls matter, and so we absolutely need people to follow through with this, and contact their elected officials. We have about a week to go. And so there are things that you can do at an individual level, but then there's also things that you can do as an organization. As I mentioned before, there are about I think 52 organizations. Last time I checked, I was on vacation for a couple of days, but there are 52 organizations that have signed on in support of the reimagined police package. And so not all of them are traditional activist organizations, right? And so we don't necessarily even have to only depend on those. So some of those organizations are religious institutions. Some of those organizations are like churches, synagogues, and Black fraternities and sorority organizations. And so a lot of non-traditional organizations out here who just feel and understand that this is a very critical moment, and they can play a part. They are, their organization matters. So if we can get some more organizations to sign on to say that we support this, that also means something, right? If we can grow this list to 75 by the end of next week, that would be amazing, right? So some of them are democratic organizations like VA Justice Dems, or women's groups, or what have you. So there's really no limit. To how much leverage I think we can muster here. And so we're asking for individual support, but we're also asking for organizations to lend their voice to this matter, post things on social media, send official letters to their elected officials, send letters to the chairs of the public safety committees and the justice committees in the Senate and the House, and let's keep this momentum going.
Absolutely. And I'd be remiss if I don't bring up the upcoming election.
Yes.
We talk about, especially in Virginia, every year, right? This is the most important election of our lifetime. And the gravity of this one in particular does feel like the most important election of our lifetime. And, I think because of all of the things that we've talked about tonight, I think it also speaks to the importance of local elections, not just the big presidentials, but the local elections, because, people sometimes forget, especially in Virginia, right, when we have fatigue for elections every single year, how important, local elections matter. That, yes, the presidential does this November, but to stay engaged beyond that. Can you talk about the importance of voting this election?
Yes. So the special session is in August, and so there's opportunities to get involved in contacting your elected officials, from the General Assembly before August. So that is our big push. But beyond that, we do need to make sure that we get involved in voting. And make sure that we keep people in place who are going to uphold the values of that we share. So even when we talk specifically about policing, So about 90% of police budgets actually come from their local jurisdictions or local county budgets. So we talk about defunding and we look at the General Assembly, but we also need to make sure that we're contacting our local officials and making sure that we ask for these same things here, because a lot of policing is handled locally. We can get things done at the General Assembly, but we could also get things done locally as well. And so paying attention to all of those elections, all of those elections matter. They're the ones that appoint the police chief, right? They're our local sheriff in Fairfax County is elected herself. So these local issues, the things that touch our lives on a daily basis are more likely than not to handle locally. So we have to definitely pay attention to local elections.
Absolutely. And where can people go to find out more about the work you're doing, more about the organization, the Activated People?
Sure. So the website is theactivatedpeople.com. It's been scrolling across the ticker for throughout the program. So activatedpeople.com. Make sure I get the actual extension of the URL correctly. So if you want to find out more about the Reimagine Police package, it's theactivatedpeople.com/re-imagine-police-package. And I know that's popping up on the ticker there. So thank you for that. And also, if you follow our Facebook page, it's facebook.com/theactivatedpeople. We have a lot of videos, links there to previous town halls we've had. If you want to find a little bit more defunding, there's also a podcast about defunding that we've done. A lot of information. We're going to keep updating these, both the Facebook page as well as the Reimagine Police page as well. There's also a list of all the organizations. We want to thank all of our supporters on the Reimagine Police package page. They're all listed there. We really couldn't be here today without your genuine support.
Well, thank you so much for being with us tonight. But more importantly, thank you for everything you are doing to make our communities better, because your work and your activism and your ability to bring so many people together around these important issues is so needed right now. So thank you for everything you're doing. And we look forward to having you back, because I would love to kind of run through a checklist after we finish this special session, what got done and what didn't get done, and how we can ensure it gets done when they go back into session in January. So thank you, Kofi, for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Lindsey. This was my pleasure, and I really appreciate all the work that you're doing and to give me the opportunity to talk about these issues.
Well, thank you. And thank you all for joining us this evening. We look forward to seeing you next week. Good night.